here? Okay, great. There we go. Good morning. My name is Eric Armbrecht. I'm the chair of the Midwest CEPAC. I'm a professor at St. Louis University in the Center for Health Outcomes Research and the School of Medicine there. We welcome everyone today to Chicago for a very important topic and wonderful discussion today. ICER is, in the CEPAC in particular, have done a pretty good job over the last few years of creating an environment where we have wonderful dialogue on difficult topics, and today we'll fall into that tradition. So I'm going to ask our Midwest CEPAC panel members to introduce themselves and also provide any updates to their financial conflicts of interest that may have, everyone provides those ahead of time, but if there have been any updates since the provision of that, please let us know. So I have no additional or no amendments to my conflict of interest that's already been filed.
Hi everyone, I'm Bijan Bora. I'm a professor of health services research at Mayo Clinic College of Medicine. I don't have any conflict of interest.
Good morning, I'm Don Casey, an internist, president of the American College of Medical Quality, also on the faculty of the University of Minnesota Institute for Healthcare Informatics, Thomas Jefferson College of Population Health, and Rush here in Chicago. And my conflicts are none, and I don't have any additions to what's listed. Thanks.
Good morning, Stacy Doucette-Zena. I'm an associate professor at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine, and I have no conflicts of interest.
Good morning, I'm Greg Kerfman. I'm a deputy editor at the medical journal JAMA here in Chicago, and I have no conflicts.
Good morning. I'm Reem Mustafa. I'm an associate professor at the University of Kansas Medical Center, and I direct the outcomes and implementation research at the Kidney Institute. And I have no financial conflicts of interest.
Good morning. I'm Stuart Winston. I'm a cardiologist and patient experience consultant in Ann Arbor, Michigan at St. Joe's Hospital and IHA. I have no conflicts of interest.
I'm Rachel Sachs, an associate professor of law at Washington University in St. Louis, and I have no conflicts to declare.
I'm Aaron Carroll. I'm a professor of pediatrics at Indiana University School of Medicine, and I have no conflicts of interest.
Hi, I'm Kurt Vandenbosch. I'm a pharmacist with St. Luke's Health System, excuse me, in Idaho, and I have no conflicts of interest.
My name is Jill Johnson, and I am a professor at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, and I'm a pharmacist, and I have no updates to my conflict of interest.
I'm Nicholas Bagley. I am a law professor at the University of Michigan, and I have no conflicts of interest.
Thank you, everyone. One of the things that I do request is that our speakers, including the roundtable participants and individuals making public comments, also announce any financial relationships that they have with industry or other influencers on the judgments or comments that they may be making today. This is just part of our tradition and policy and approach with ICER for public disclosure and transparency on such matters. I'd like to introduce the president of ICER, Steve Pearson, right now, to carry us through this morning's session. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everybody. I'm just going to be here for a brief introduction. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. They're not really just housekeeping, but because of the topic today and because of the folks who have come to participate, we may need to dim the lights at some point. We may need to do different things to try to help accommodate people who might be suffering different kinds of symptoms. So we want to be sensitive to that. Anybody who does wear perfume or cologne, if you can not reapply it or do everything you can to try to be sensitive to folks in this room who may be sensitive to those kinds of smells and other effects. So we just went through, talking about conflicts of interest. Just a show of hands, how many people here, either themselves or among those that they love, know somebody who has migraine that has severely affected their lives? Yep.
Is that everybody?
Pretty much everybody, yeah. And me too. I have to admit, a person in my family would be a candidate for these new treatments. And migraine, I have migraine, certainly not to the degree that many people do suffer with it, but most of us either do or have loved ones who do have migraine, who at least at some point in their lives, if not continuously, have felt that it has been a great limitation and a major problem, and it is across all segments of American life. So let's just start there. But why are we here? Let me also quote a few patients here. And this is a long quote, but bear with me if you will. "Migraine has a major and negative impact on my life. In 2005, my husband and I decided that I would stop working due to the challenges of living with migraine disease. I was missing work and found it difficult to maintain a regular schedule. Since then, I've given birth to 2 amazing children. If you ask either of them, they will tell you that they wish they had a normal life with a healthy mother. They wish I could take them to the park on nice days and play with them. Often, I'm not well enough to do so. They are happy and provided for, but I could be giving them more. I could be contributing to the household and society more. Over the years, I've tried various triptans, and I've always had the same reaction to the medications. Nothing helps, and they actually seem to make things worse. For now, I do nothing to treat my attacks, and it's no way to live. Some days, I feel frantic for relief from the pain and other symptoms, but there's nowhere to turn. I'm trapped with this. I desperately need access to new types of acute treatments." So we're here today partly because of the acknowledged burden of illness that migraine can create for patients and their families and for society. There are other reasons too, because when new treatments are approved by the FDA, what happens on that day, and it's not always that specific day, but what happens is that patients and clinicians often do rejoice because an unmet need has another option on the table to consider. And that brings a lot of hope with it. The other thing that tends to happen on that day, if it hasn't happened already, is that manufacturers and insurers start to talk about coverage and pricing. And largely in this country, without a national or federal approach to negotiation, this does devolve down to private payers who largely want to cover drugs and largely feel, therefore, that the price that is set by the company, and is set by the company in that negotiation, is one that they can negotiate around. And so what happens is that this negotiation takes different forms, and we'll be talking about it, but it can lead to try different measures to try to control costs that can create barriers to care. They can try to tailor it so that the right patients get the drug, obviously, but it can create complexity, perceived barriers, stress, tension, out-of-pocket burden, right? All of the faults that we see in our healthcare system sometimes can actually be concentrated shortly after a great day, a day when there's a new treatment available. So we think that it's really important to bring those discussions and the evidence that support them into the public domain, and to have a public deliberation with a group of objective, non-conflicted people to look at the evidence and to hear testimony, to wrestle with some of these issues and to work through what value means and how it should be applied throughout the healthcare system. Another thing I wanted to point out is that sometimes we get trapped into thinking about this as saving money, and I just wanted to try out, and I apologize, this is the one slide that didn't get darkened. This is a gross visual of a concept. You'll have to tell me later whether it works. But basically, what we want to do in a healthcare system is to treat people with a condition, and that's the individual with their child there on one side, while recognizing that in any system of healthcare, there are ultimately limited resources, and we have to keep our eye on the entire population so that we can maintain affordable healthcare for them. And there's this balance, and it is a balance. And the question is, when pricing does or does not align with the value to the people who are receiving the treatment, we get different effects on the other side of this scale. And if we do overpay for the health that we're getting for the treated patients, it comes from somewhere, and it's not just money, it's people. Whoops, that didn't work out at all. This was supposed to have another animation, because what evidence is increasingly showing is that as healthcare premiums go up, families drop health insurance because they can't afford it. In 2 years, the last 2 years, with one of the best economic stretches in our country's history, near full employment, 2 million more Americans don't have health insurance than they did in 2017. and among those 400,000 additional children without health insurance in the United States. That's just unacceptable. Now, drugs and drug pricing are not the only factor leading into this. Everybody knows that. But we still have an opportunity in these kinds of public meetings to talk about how we get this balance right, how we can make sure that the treatment is recognized for its benefits, that the price aligns with that so that the benefits we are getting are fairly balanced with the costs that are borne by others. Because it's about health, and it's about people who are in this room, but also people who are not in this room, whose lives are going to be affected by how much their health insurance costs next year. So that's a piece of the conceptual pie that we have to wrestle with today. You've heard about the Midwest Comparative Effectiveness Public Advisory Council. They've introduced themselves. Just a couple words about ICER. We serve as the academic kind of secretariat and the convening body here. So our financial conflicts of interest, we try to keep updated on our website with this pie chart. And again, it shows that the vast majority of our funding comes from nonprofit foundations. The chief funder within that is the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. There's also, the California Healthcare Foundation, National Institute for Healthcare Management, and others. And we have a separate, function of, it didn't come out either, a separate group of funding that comes from manufacturers as life science companies and health plans and provider groups. That 21% goes separately to fund an evidence policy summit each year and an associated set of webinars. So that money is not spent to do the research and to host the meetings we have like here today. So the report itself is developed over about a 7.5-month period. It starts with advice, scoping we call it, guidance from patient groups, clinical experts, manufacturers, and other stakeholders, when we basically open our doors and say, what do we need to know? What don't we know? Help us. Then we take off and we say, okay, now we've heard, we know what's important to patients, what manufacturers and clinical experts have to tell us, and we go and start to do a deep dive into the evidence analysis. At the same time, we launch a cost-effectiveness effort, and today that was led by Professor Dan Touchette and Todd Lee at the University of Illinois at Chicago. The report, in addition to internal back and forth with patient groups and others, it undergoes formal public comment and revision, and we also had 2 clinical expert reviewers, Jeff Klingmann, who's here with us today, the Chief of Neurology at Kaiser Permanente, and Kevin Lenneberg, the Executive Director at the Coalition for Headache and Migraine Patients. Now, the evidence itself, and by evidence I'm speaking very broadly, evidence means perspectives, it means other things are in our report. How is it grouped and structured? Well, first, we do structure it in a way because we feel that all stakeholders have a commitment to the basic idea that we want fair pricing linked to fair access in a system that generates future innovation. That's what we all want. It's obviously hard to get there, and people have different opinions. But when we're looking at the evidence around new treatments, we think that means decision makers need to think about 2 different things. One is, what's the long-term value for money for treatments? We don't want to shortchange it by not recognizing its long-term benefits. But also, in the real world of budgets, we have to think about whether, even if it's a good long-term value, there might be so many patients or such other issues that might raise short-term affordability constraints. Those 2 sometimes have to be really wrestled with. Now, long-term value for money itself has a kind of a complex buildup, and to us in our report, we separated into comparative clinical effectiveness information, into information from the economic model on incremental cost effectiveness, and we'll also spend a fair amount today talking about things that we call potential other benefits or disadvantages and contextual considerations. These are things that aren't captured directly in the clinical trials. It doesn't mean that they're not important. It could be benefits to the patients themselves or to the families or to society, things that we should want to recognize in some way and make sure that decision makers, the true decision makers, are aware of the broader context in which this evidence and this condition exist. Obviously, potential budget impact is the kind of piece that people will use to discuss whether there will or won't be a short-term affordability problem. All right, so that's the way the report is structured. That's the way a lot of this meeting will be structured and the votes that we'll take. So that's kind of the conceptual background. The agenda for today will run till 4 o'clock, and you'll see that we'll start with a presentation of the clinical evidence. I'm glad we have clinical experts and patient experts at the front table, and we'll introduce them before we get started there. Then we'll have the presentation of the economic model, followed by manufacturer public comments, and then discussion and public comments and discussion. We will break for lunch. Lunch for the audience members will be out here in the hallway at noon, and we'll reconvene at 1 o'clock to start further deliberation and the voting, followed by a brief break around 2:15 so that we can start a policy roundtable discussion at 2:30. I'll say more about that at the time, but the basic idea is to move from talking about the evidence and its context into thinking about the future. What does this mean for the future of how these drugs will be covered by insurers, about how they should or will be priced, about how much patients will or won't have to pay out of pocket, about what future research needs are, about what the FDA should have done. All those kinds of things we'll bring to the table at that point. And then we'll adjourn by 4 o'clock so that we can all try to grab the same taxi to the airport and see if O'Hare's still open. All right, well, I'm going to hand it back over to the chair to help introduce our patient experts and clinical experts, following which we'll have the clinical evidence, and we'll kick off with that. But again, thank you for coming today, and we look forward to everybody's contributions. Mr. Chair?
So we have 4 patient and clinical experts with us today, and so we welcome them. And I'll just let you introduce yourselves briefly. Behind you, you'll find a brief description of who you are and declared financial conflicts of interest. So if there's anything to update from the screen behind you, please let us know. But we'll start with Katie. Welcome.
Thank you. As far as the disclosures, I do want to point out that the amount of money that I received from any of these organizations, nonprofits that are funded by pharma, were less than, I think the threshold was 5,000, Zunelli? Yeah, so it was less than $5,000 a year. So I'm not making big money. And I'm sorry, would you like me to introduce myself? Or
for the record, you're the Director of Patient Relations for, like, the organization that you're with would be helpful.
Sure. So I am the Director of Patient Relations for CHAMP, the Coalition for Headache and Migraine Patients. It was founded in 2017, and all of the nonprofits in the migraine, headache, and cluster space have gotten together and trying to have one voice, trying to together work with patients, educate them on their disease, access barriers, workplace issues, accommodations. And so I interact with patients like me online almost every day, and have since I became fully disabled at the age of 30, and I have intractable chronic migraine. For the past 9 years, I have not had a break in pain, but I'm very excited to be here, and this is my second ICER review. So.
Thank you for being with us. Sarah?
Thanks.
Good morning. I'm Sarah Wells-Kosas. I'm Vice President of Public Policy at the Society for Women's Health Research in Washington, D.C. I'm honored to be here today representing the patient advocacy perspective. The Society for Women's Health Research is a nearly 30-year-old national nonprofit. We're dedicated to improving women's health through science, policy, and education. We're a recognized thought leader on research in biological sex differences in health and disease, including migraine, which is 3 times more common in women than in men. SWHR has a deep understanding of this disease and its burden. We have engaged with an interdisciplinary network of migraine patients, healthcare researchers, providers, and policy thought leaders that we established several years ago. So thank you for the opportunity, and I have no updates to my disclosures.
Thank you for being with us today. Christopher?
My name is Chris Gottschalk. I'm the Director of Headache Medicine and the Section Chief of General Neurology at Yale. I have no updates to my disclosures, but I want to comment that, as Dr. Pearson has made it clear, that this organization is sensitive to nuance, that it is, I think, at least equally relevant that I am conflicted and biased by the fact that I treat thousands of patients every year with this condition, and in 25 years of practice, have seen literally tens of thousands who tell a wide range of stories about what happens, what doesn't happen, what should happen, et cetera. And I think that's why I'm excited and honored to be here, is to have the opportunity to talk about some of that.
Thank you. Jeff?
Yeah, hi, my name is Jeff Klingmann. I'm the chair of neurology at Kaiser Permanente in Northern California, practice general neurology, and a lot of other things, and I've also treated thousands of people in 30 years, so I'm right with you there on that, and actually flew in last night because sort of a last-minute thing, so I'm glad to be here to help out with this process.
We're thrilled to have all four of you here, your experience. Thank you for bringing it to Chicago today. So I think we're going to now move to the presentations. And I believe our first presentation of the clinical evidence would be Stephen Atlas, Primary Care Research and Quality Improvement Network, Mass General. So welcome to Chicago, Steve.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm a primary care physician at Mass General in Boston, and associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. Whoops, what did I just do? Just do this. My collaborators on this include Felusa Gabula from ICER, as well as Nomi Flush and Eric Borelli, who are responsible for much of the information that I'm going to present this morning. As we've heard, migraine is a common, typically episodic cause of disabling headache associated with nausea and sensitivity to light and sound. It's common, serious, and expensive. About 40 million Americans have migraines or severe headaches, representing 12 to 15% of the adult population in the US. It's associated with decreased productivity and increased work loss and disability claims. And depending on how one accounts for total cost, it's expensive, $11 to $50 billion a year. As you've heard, the impact on patients is large. It's an episodic and chronic disease that can profoundly impact all aspects of their lives and the lives of those close to them. Existing therapies don't work in all patients, and even if helpful, headaches can recur as treatments wear off, and response can vary from one migraine attack to another, and the effects can decrease over time. Side effects of existing therapies can lead to discontinuation, or patients may have contraindications to the use of these medicines. As a result, for those with moderate or severe migraines, there is no single or combined therapy that offers reliable long-term control of acute attacks. Symptoms of migraine affect a variety of body parts: headache, dizziness, fatigue, numbness. There are sensory symptoms that include sensitivity, as you heard, to light, sound, or smells. Patients with migraines can see spots, wavy lines, flashing lights. Medically, we call that term aura. And it can be associated with side effects such as nausea and vomiting that can be quite severe. There are existing standards of care for migraine. There are non-specific over-the-counter headache medications such as aspirin, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen, and Tylenol, acetaminophen, that can be used alone or in combination. And these are considered first-line treatments for those with mild symptoms. There are also migraine-specific medicines. The most common are called the triptans, or 5-hydroxytryptamine, 5-HT, or serotonin receptor agonists. These are the most commonly used, and those are common for those with moderate or severe symptoms or who lack response to the over-the-counter medicines. There are other migraine-specific medicines, such as ergotamine preparations, that are used less commonly, and for people with severe nausea and vomiting, there's antiemetic medicines. We're here today to talk about potential new targets for therapy, one being a selective triptan, or a 5-HT1F agonist, that are nicknamed the DITANs. And the second class is the calcitonin gene-related peptide receptor, the CGRP antagonists, or depending how you call it, GPANTs or GAPANTs. As mentioned, we had discussions with patients during our scoping process, and patients highlighted the need for new therapies. They commented that available therapies used alone or in combination do not reliably manage or prevent migraine attacks. Available therapies provide symptom relief. They don't provide symptom relief for those with migraine attacks with minimal side effects. And for many, triptans do not work. They may have intolerable side effects, or they have contraindications to their use. And this emphasizes the dramatic impact on migraines on all aspects of life: relationships with friends and family, ability to work, issues leading to disability, and economic hardship. Our scope of review is to evaluate the clinical effectiveness of 3 new drugs, lasmiditan, rimegepant, and ubrogepant, for acute treatment of migraine with or without aura in adult patients. We've chosen comparators from 2 broad categories. One is, we'll term population 1 is a group where there's no additional migraine-specific medication as the comparator, and this will be reflected in the placebo arm of the trials that we'll describe. And this is if there is non-prescription medicines and the triptans are ineffective, not tolerated, or contraindicated. The second comparator is the triptans themselves, if someone is eligible to use them and non-prescription medicines are ineffective or not tolerated. The 2 that we will focus on are called sumatriptan and elatriptan. There are 7 total that are FDA approved in the US. We chose these 2 because sumatriptan is one of the most common and elatriptan in reviews is one of the most effective. The new treatments that we'll talk about, lasmiditan is given at 50 to 200 milligrams as needed, and it's in its FDA prescribing that was approved in October. There's only 1 dose in 24 hours is permitted. Rimegepant is a 75 milligram oral pill as needed daily. The details for its use are not yet available because it's still under FDA review. For ubrogepant, it's 50 to 100 milligrams as needed. A second dose at least 2 hours after initial therapy can be given, up to 200 milligrams over the course of a day. And this was most recently approved before the Christmas holiday. The key outcomes that we'll be talking about are reflected in these trials. The primary outcomes were pain freedom at 2 hours post-dose. Pain freedom meaning there's the absence of pain. They also, in some of the trials, included what was the most bothersome symptom at 2 hours after the medication dose. A variety of secondary outcomes were assessed, including pain relief at 2 hours post-dose, and this is either the absence of pain, the pain freedom, plus the addition of mild pain. And then there was also sustained pain freedom and pain relief at 24 hours in those who had response at 2 hours. There were other outcomes, including relief from other migraine symptoms, such as photophobia, phonophobia, visual symptoms, hearing symptoms, nausea, vomiting, as well as functional improvement and disability outcomes. We also looked at harms, including side effects and discontinuation of the medicines. So turning to the clinical evidence, we conducted a systematic review based on the criteria laid out in our report, and we identified 33 single migraine attack trials to include in our network meta-analysis. A network meta-analysis is a way to quantitatively combine results from different trials. And I want to emphasize that these trials included the treatment of just a single episode of migraine, and we'll come back to that. For lasmiditan, there were 3 trials, and they're represented here. Over 4,000 patients. Rimegepant had 4 trials. Of note, one of those trials included an arm which compared rimegepant to an active comparator, which was sumatriptan. There were 3 trials for ubrogepant, and for the triptan trials, they're listed here. Most of them are single drug trials, and the largest have been in sumatriptan. There were, however, 2 trials that we found that compared sumatriptan to elatriptan. Looking broadly at the characteristics of the patients who were included in these trials, over 80% were female, as you've heard. The average age was 40. Patients in these trials had long-standing migraines, on average for 20 years or more. The frequency of migraines were 3 to 5 per month in the recent intervention trials and 1 to 8 per month in the triptan trials. And in all of these trials, patients were allowed to use preventive medicines, generally up to a quarter of patients. Of note, the newer CGRP monoclonals were not included in any of these trials. One of the limitations of the trials is after the primary outcome was assessed at 2 hours, there were big differences in how the trials compared the use of rescue treatments for those who had persistent symptoms or who had recurrent symptoms after some initial improvement. In the trials, the rescue medications could be used between 2 and 24 to 48 hours, depending on the trial. And there were differences in what they could do depending on the trial. So for lasmiditan trials, they were re-randomized at 2 hours if they needed to take something to placebo or lasmiditan, but no other medicines were allowed. In the rimegepant trials, no additional study drug was allowed. And in the ibrogepant trial, if you were given placebo initially, you were randomized to get placebo again, or if you were given active agent, you were re-randomized to placebo or ibrogepant. And then the trials also differed in the use of other medicines that could be used for rescue, including triptans, ergots, opiates, and barbiturates. So there were big differences that we'll come back to. Turning to the results of the phase 3 trials for the primary outcome of pain freedom as well as pain relief, a greater proportion of patients achieved pain freedom at 2 hours with the interventions compared to placebo. So for example, for lasmiditan in the trials, it was 28 to 32% versus 15 to 21% for placebo, 19 to 21% for rimegepant versus 10 to 14% for placebo, and for ibrogepant, 19 to 20% also in similar numbers. There were similar trends with higher proportions observed for pain relief at 2 hours, again for these interventions compared to the placebo. So in talking about the network meta-analysis, this is just a framework that all of these drugs are primarily being compared to placebo. And you can see the number of trials that contribute evidence, and so the more trials, the more certain we can be about the effects. As noted, there was one trial comparing rimegepant directly with sumatriptan, as well as the 2 trials that I mentioned with sumatriptan versus elatriptan. Of note, there were no trials that directly compared the 3 agents under discussion. So turning to the NMA results, this is pain freedom at 2 hours, and let me just sort of orient you. So each of the 5 different drugs are listed across the top, and we're going to start by comparing them to placebo, so the bottom row. And the important thing is that this is odds ratios, and numbers higher than 1 indicate that the active treatment is better than placebo. So as you can see, all of these 5 drugs have higher numbers. You can also see that none of them cross 1, meaning that these are statistically significant differences. And then finally, you can also see that for sumatriptan and elatriptan compared to placebo, with ratios of 4 and 5.6, these are greater than for the other 3 drugs. And this is then reflected above, where comparing these lasmiditan, rimegepant, ibrogepant to the triptans, their ratios are less than 1, meaning they're not as good. If it doesn't cross 1, they're statistically significant, and most of them are, with the exception of lasmiditan versus sumatriptan, which, while less effective, the 0.73, the ratio includes 1, meaning that it is not statistically significant. Finally, compared, lasmiditan appeared to have higher odds, 1.43, compared to rimegepant and ibrogepant. But again, these were not statistically significant differences. Similar results were found comparing the pain relief outcome, that lasmiditan, rimegepant, and ibrogepant showed higher odds of achieving pain relief compared to placebo. There were no statistically significant differences between the 3 interventions for these, and again, lasmiditan showed a non-statistically significant higher odds of achieving pain relief compared to rimegepant and ibrogepant. And all three of these interventions for this outcome also showed lower odds of achieving relief compared to the triptans. And as mentioned, and similarly, lasmiditan versus sumatriptan was not statistically significant. Looking at some other important patient outcomes, the sustained pain freedom outcome, this is continued relief from pain if you had it at 2 hours. So all interventions had higher odds of achieving sustained pain freedom at 24 hours versus placebo. The most bothersome symptom was also improved with these interventions compared to placebo at 2 hours. The disability outcome, having patients reporting no disability at 2 hours, was also greater with these treatments than placebo. And for these outcomes, similarly, compared to each other, none of them showed statistically significant differences. So a couple comments about limitations of network meta-analysis. As mentioned, there was only one head-to-head trial of the interventions, and that was the rimegepant versus a triptan. Because no study directly compared the interventions to each other, we used indirect quantitative methods. And these methods lead to more uncertainty than if we had data that directly compared the drugs to each other. And finally, as I showed in the slide of the results, there were some differences in the baseline placebo rate. And so we adjusted for the placebo rate in the trial in reporting the comparisons. Turning to the harms of these drugs, first for rimegepant and ubrogepant. In general, they had mild to moderate side effects, adverse events. Nausea was the most common. There were no differences in adverse events or treatment emergent adverse events between these drugs versus placebo and the triptans in these single-dose trials. In an open-label trials where people could use them repeatedly, there were low rates of discontinuation for these drugs. 2.2 versus 2.7% were reported. Turning to lasmiditan, they also showed mild to moderate adverse events, most commonly involving central nervous symptoms like dizziness, somnolence, and paresthesia, or numbness. These events, while uncommon, were more common than with the rimegepant and ubrogepant. And they were also more common compared to the triptans. In the open label study of lasmiditan, almost 13% of patients discontinued the drug due to adverse events during therapy, with dizziness being the most common side effect that led to discontinuation. Turning to controversies and uncertainties, patients highlighted the importance of outcome after 2 hours, but as mentioned, the use of rescue medicines differed among the trials, making it difficult to assess the benefits of these new drugs after 2 hours. Dan Touchette will go into this more when he talks about the modeling. Since most data for these drugs come from trials treating just a single migraine attack, outcomes when used over time for repeated attacks remain uncertain, as well as the long-term impact on these new therapies on quality of life, on work and productivity remain unknown at present. We also heard from comments back about the potential for these new medicines to decrease the frequency of migraines over time with ongoing use. In reviewing the evidence, we found problems with this that made us reluctant to account for this in our analyses. These included the fact that there was a high frequency of attacks at baseline. These are from the open label trials. And decreases over time may simply be due to regression to the mean, meaning there was no comparator to say that the decrease was associated directly with the medicines. If those with the greatest migraine burden don't benefit and drop out, and there was significant dropout in the open label trials, the remaining patients with fewer migraines or baseline are left. And so we may be overemphasizing overestimating any decrease in frequency by seeing a drop-off in patients over time. We also, for lasmiditan, wondered why lasmiditan, which we think works similar to the mechanism for triptans, would show this benefit when it hasn't been shown for the triptans. As well as there was another trial of a gepant, telegepant, that was withdrawn from the market compared to a different triptan in more than 1,000 patients that actually showed similar reductions in headache frequency over time. So not showing the same thing. And then finally, there's been shown a decrease in migraine-specific days per month in the trials of the monoclonal antibodies for prevention. But the magnitude of the decrease in those trials is considerably smaller than what these open label studies showed. So for all of these reasons, we did not include the potential for this without further evidence. Turning to other potential benefits, obviously for patients not responding to other therapies, having intolerable side effects or contraindications to their use, these new therapies may offer an important new therapeutic option. These new drugs have not been shown to cause vasoconstriction, but whether they are safe for those who have cardiovascular disease remains to be proven because these patients were excluded from the trials that I mentioned. And as mentioned, how these new drugs compare to each other, especially with prolonged use over time, remains to be seen. We received important public comments. One of them included the importance of adjusting for differences in placebo rates over time, and we did that. There was also an emphasis on focusing on outcomes, that the focus on outcomes up to 2 hours may miss important differences among these medications after that, in the 2 to 8 hour. And Dan will be talking about that more in some of his analyses. And finally, there was comments about outcomes may differ in certain subgroups, specifically those who've used triptans before versus those who were triptan naive compared to placebo in these trials. And while there were some differences, they were not statistically significant differences, so we did not include them in our models. So in summary, for lasmiditan, we have evidence of improved outcomes compared to placebo, similar or slightly better to the gepants, and similar or slightly worse than the triptans. These were generally well tolerated, but there were more side effects with lasmiditan than with rimigepant, ubrogepant, and the triptans, and they were more likely to be discontinued than the gepants. For rimegepant and ubrogepant, there were also improved outcomes compared to placebo, similar or slightly worse than lasmiditan, and worse than the triptans. There were few side effects of these medicines. They were similar to each other and to the triptans, and fewer than those seen in lasmiditan. So in terms of our ICER evidence rating, for population 1, the people who can't tolerate the triptans or over-the-counter medicines haven't worked, lasmiditan, rimigepant, and ubrogepant versus placebo are considered incremental or better, a B-positive rating. For the second population who may still be eligible for triptans, these 3 drugs versus the triptans were considered comparable or inferior, a C- rating. And then for all patients with migraine attacks, we considered rimegepant versus ubrogepant to be comparable, a C rating. And then comparing lasmiditan to rimegepant and ubrogepant, we considered them to be comparable or inferior, a C- rating. So with that, I'd like to pause, and I'm glad to take any questions.
So if we have any questions from the CPAC members, we'll use our usual convention of standing up your table tent so I can call on you. Any initial questions? Rachel?
I was just wondering, seeing the references in the report to previous GPANTs which had been discontinued in their evaluation for various reasons, were the reasons for those discontinuations incorporated into clinical trials for the drugs we're reviewing today? Are there other adverse events that we should be thinking about in the back of our minds where we don't have evidence yet and things like that?
We did not focus on there. As I mentioned, we were only interested in these 3 drugs that were before the FDA. So we did not include examination of trials for other GPANTs for acute treatment, with the exception of what we mentioned in terms of some secondary information.
Right.
There were side effects of these that led them to the company to not pursue FDA approval. I don't know the details about why it was chosen. There also were other drugs coming to market that potentially had better efficacy and side effect profiles.
Right. My question is just whether the hepatotoxicity that was observed in those previous trials was looked at in these trials as well.
Yes,
Right.
and there's no mention that was seen.
But we don't have a biological explanation for that yet?
Not that I'm aware of. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Steve, thank you very much for a really terrific presentation, very clear. And I wanted to underscore and get your comments about a point that you made very well. And that is that with all of these products, we're lacking data on head-to-head comparisons among them, between them and among them. And network meta-analysis is fine as far as it goes in trying to do that kind of analysis. But it's not a direct head-to-head comparison. And physicians prescribing these drugs really need this information. Patients really need this information, trying to make decisions about their therapies. And yet, drug companies are not providing this kind of information. And as a medical journal editor, I see that this is not unique to these drugs. This happens all the time, that we lack head-to-head comparison data when we really very much need it in making clinical decisions. So I just wanted to underscore that. I know that I suspect there are people from industry here. I wanted them to hear that issue, and maybe Steve, you might want to comment about it as well.
I'll leave the details to our clinical experts as they sort of read the tea leaves of the comparison between these medicines. As a practicing clinician, I'm going to be using these medicines, and I'm going to struggle with sort of how to do it. And we're going to do it by looking to experts, looking to our own experience. It's well known that, and I'm not an expert here, but the incentives to do these head-to-head comparisons are limited. And yet that makes it difficult for clinicians and patients to have the best evidence to choose these medicines appropriately.
Stacy, would you like to?
I don't know whether for...
It'll also, this will be a great topic for our policy roundtable when we come to that.
Yeah, I think, thank you.
All right, thank you. I have a question about, I think it's Sumatriptan that had, it seemed, a higher side effect of dizziness and a potential warning around driving impairment and things like that. I'm just wondering to what extent, thinking that may make it difficult for people, for example, who are benefiting from the treatment to stay at work, for example. Just curious if that is something we should view as a significant other concern for just this drug and not the other comparators.
Right, so the question is regarding lasmiditan. As mentioned in the evidence, there was greater CNS side effects. In the FDA labeling for the drug, it's recommended that lasmiditan, that someone who takes lasmiditan should not drive for the subsequent, I believe, 8 hours. And I think that was a reflection on the side effects of the medicine. Now, those are recommendations, what patients and doctors do, but I think it's a reflection of the side effects that we presented.
Katie, would you like to add a comment or question for us?
I do, however, I think the comments about the head-to-head trials and some of the other issues that were raised, sounds like we're going to bring those to the panel discussion.
Yeah.
So I will, but I actually do have a few questions of my own on the data that was shown, and is it appropriate for me to ask?
Put them forward right now, and then we'll figure out if we've got time to address them, or we'll defer it for a little later.
Sure, thank you, I appreciate it. I wanted to ask or point out the 2-hour pain relief endpoint. Am I correct in saying that 2-hour endpoint is for at pain freedom or pain relief? The pain is talking about head pain and not the associated symptoms. You can have a migraine and not have head pain. The other symptoms, the things that are not mentioned, the cognitive impairment, which I will stumble over my words because I have aphasia. That is directly related to my disease. The allodynia, where I'm sensitive to being touched. There are so many more things than photophobia and some of the things that everybody just rattles off. So also the 2-hour endpoint is an FDA kind of random endpoint. It used to be 4 hours. It's 2 hours. Why? We don't know. I'm actually part of as a patient consultant, as part of a joint NIH FDA combined grant for migraine clinical outcome assessments, and the 2-hour endpoint is something that we're really interested in and actually getting patient input on that. So, I mean, I understand why the data is in there, but I want you to realize that I would love to have pain relief, and not just of head pain, but of symptoms as well.
Steve, in your review of the data, if you can provide any commentary around the 2-hour pain-free and what sort of pain they meant in those trials. And then also, I think there's a broader discussion I'm sure we'll have later regarding the 2-hour endpoint. And I think it might even come up in the economic modeling.
Yeah, so these are great comments. So first of all, with the pain relief and pain freedom, correct that these are referring to headache. The were also, second question I mentioned, the most bothersome symptom, which was the patient was able to select their non-headache symptom that was most bothersome and to report on that.
I see.
So that's that's a great clarification. The other is, it is true that as a clinician, when I talk with my patients, they want fast relief and they want sustained relief. So the 2-hour time point may address that first one, which is how quickly do the medicines work. But rebound and recurrence of symptoms also matters a great deal to the patients who I take care of with this. And so that isn't as well reflected in that 2-hour time point. So I think that's a very important thing, and something that Dan and his team have thought a lot about in terms of the economic modeling, and something that I know that we'll be discussing more.
And I think we're going to move to the economic presentation now. So I know we've got a couple other questions from Aaron and Don, but we'll try to pick those up after the economic model presentation.
I'm
Thank
sorry,
you.
is there one last statement
Sure.
that I can make? Am I also correct, this is my second time going through an ICER review, and am I correct in this time that there are no patient advocates from other disease areas on the voting panel today?
So the voting panel has always been an independent group and has not had a direct patient representative as a voting member.
Mm-hmm.
But many of us bring patient experience or clinical experience to this in terms of the people here casting votes. Yeah.
Dr. Pearson, sorry I can't see you, but the last, for prevention of migraine, the review, there were absolutely 2 patients. One had had in the cancer space, and the other patient I can't remember, but on the voting panel where
Yes,
you
we
all are
have
sitting,
them. They
that
weren't
is-
available for this meeting for today, but in
Okay.
general, we do.
Okay, thank you.
So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Dan Touchette, my colleague, who will be presenting the economic model. Dan?
All right, thank you, Steve. I want to present the key review team members who were a part of developing this model. There's myself and Todd Lee, who is a pharmacoepidemiologist at University of Illinois at Chicago, and we have no financial disclosures at this time. The objective of the cost effectiveness analysis was to estimate the cost effectiveness of acute treatments for migraine compared to each other and to 3 comparators in 2 separate and distinct populations. The methods that we used follow the typical ICER review with a couple of exceptions, and I'll point those out. The first exception was that we used a 2-year time horizon so that in the model we could actually model shorter time frames than is typical for chronic conditions that we often model. So we have a 2-year time horizon for this. And then the cycle length is a very short cycle length. What we tried to do with this is we tried to model each migraine episode, or at least 48 hours worth of a migraine episode, so that we could capture as much of the consequences of the migraine as was possible. And then the cost consequence piece that we modeled was a cost per hour of migraine pain avoided. And those differ with each of the reviews. So this is the one that we used for this one. Here is our model schematic that we used. It is a Markov model. Patients started out at the beginning of the model either being on treatment with no migraine, meaning that they would not take the treatment at that time, but they had no migraine, or they did have a migraine, and again, that was modeled with the same proportion as was likely that someone would have a migraine on day 1 of the model. And patients were allowed to move every 48 hours between these 2 different states, or remain in any particular state. We also wanted to model discontinuation of the treatment. And so in this case, we modeled what we termed off treatment with and without migraine. So there were 2 additional states which patients transitioned to when they discontinued their treatment for whatever reason. And these patients then could also transition among the off treatment, no migraine or with migraine. As I mentioned, there were 2 target populations. They are the same populations that was mentioned for the network meta-analysis or for the clinical review. And those were patients who had migraine attacks who did not respond, or rather did not have response to non-prescription medicines, and for whom triptans had not been effective, were not tolerated, or were contraindicated. And the second population were those who had migraine attacks where the medicines, who did not respond adequately to non-prescription medicines such as non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agents. The mean age of the population was 40.8 years. The gender was 86% female, and the frequency of migraines was 4.8 days per month. These are averages of all of the clinical trials, just so you know where those numbers came from. There were some important model assumptions that we needed to make because there was limited evidence in the literature that allowed us to build the model without making these assumptions. And they are that mortality is not associated with acute treatment for migraine. There's no evidence around that in any of the trials. that patients with moderate or severe pain had a probability of having an emergency department admission or hospitalization. There is evidence that this is the case, but that patients with migraine have emergency department admissions and hospitalizations. We had limited evidence around who goes to the hospital based on migraine severity or pain severity. The acute treatment of migraine with lasmiditan, rimegepant, ubrogepant, and triptans does not affect migraine frequency. You heard the reasons for that assumption in the clinical presentation. That patients receiving no benefit from treatment discontinued the medication in the first year of treatment only. There was no discontinuation for lack of effectiveness in the second year of the model. And so that assumption was based on we had information for 1 year from the long-term clinical trials. We did not have any information on what happens later on, but I think patients would likely know if they were benefiting from the treatment earlier in treatment, so we made that assumption. And then if a migraine treatment resulted in migraine pain of no pain or mild pain at 2 hours, a person would be able to work. Again, there's limited information on who can go to work and when they can go to work. And to make it fit with our model design, this was an assumption that we needed. All right, other assumptions that we had to make, or another important assumption that we had to make in order to make this model work from the clinical trial data that was available to us. And as was pointed out, we had information on who had benefit at 2 hours. And then among those who had benefit at 2 hours, what happened to them at 24 and 48 hours. And the rest of the population, we had very limited information on. So we needed to make some assumptions in order to model the entire population over this 48-hour period. And they're listed here. So for pain at 2 hours, we pulled the data directly from the meta-analysis. For pain at 8 hours, if patients were pain-free at 2 hours, we were able to pull that data again from the meta-analysis because we had information on those patients who were pain-free at 2 hours, what happened at 24 hours. For those who were not pain-free at 2 hours, we had to assume a placebo response from a paper that was published by Dodek et al. And so that's how we modeled that population, or that subgroup. For pain at 24 hours, if they were pain-free at 8 hours, they remained pain-free. If they were not pain-free at 8 hours, we again assumed the placebo response, and at 48 hours, we had the same assumptions. All right, so for those, we had to then estimate the amount of pain that patients had at each time point. It was easy for no pain because that was, again, directly from the clinical trials. We had an estimate for that. We assumed that everyone who had a reduction in the pain or had response, that they would have mild pain. So although that assumption may not be completely true, it benefits the treatments, just so you're aware in which direction the bias may go with that. And that was calculated using the same methods as no pain. For moderate pain and severe pain, we assumed that it was the same, that the percent with no response, or was taken from the percent with no response, and we assumed similar proportions of patients that were observed at baseline had moderate and severe pain. Again, it may be that those with moderate pain have increased, are more likely to have pain relief. We don't know that from the clinical trials because they don't assess it. So we had to make an assumption one way or another. We assumed that the proportions were the same for moderate and severe pain. And so with these assumptions and building them into the model, here is a 48-hour response for each of the treatments. In the, what is light green, I guess you can sort of see it as light green up there. Those are the patients who had no pain at different time points. The slightly darker green is moderate pain, mild pain rather. The darker green is moderate pain, and the darkest green is severe pain. So you can see for lasmiditan, the response versus rimegepant and ubrogepant in usual care. What you see in the usual care group is that we have fewer proportion or fewer number of patients who have no pain at these various time points. And there are also a larger number who have moderate and severe pain at these time points. And compared with the triptans, here are the same graphs. You can see that with the triptans, the response is similar, but we have a smaller proportion of patients who have moderate and severe pain, especially at the earlier time points. It's hard to see the difference, but I wanted to put these up there because this shows the differences between being treated and not being treated, that it's not a complete response in every person. Yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is still something I'm trying to make sure I understand and I think is relevant to the interpretation,
Yes.
particularly of a graphical presentation here. You said a few moments ago that you modeled the response at 8 hours as if you were pain-free. If you were not pain-free at 2 hours, then you would have a placebo response.
Correct.
In terms of the likelihood of being pain-free at 8 hours, even though for many of these studies we do have 8-hour data about the response to treatment, that there is continued assessment. So
Right.
I don't know how different the trials are in terms of capturing that 8-hour window, but I think it's important to recognize that what's on that graph and what's in your model doesn't utilize the data that is in fact available. Is that right?
Yes. The issue that we have with the 8-hour time point is that patients were allowed to take rescue medication and they were allowed to take other treatments other than the medication that was presented. And so that data is fairly confounded and difficult. We are going to present an analysis that was done that we feel was very well done and may limit or minimize those issues of confounding later in the presentation. But I think it's an important observation. We just used the placebo response that everybody got the same response if they had no response at 2 hours. We made it similar across all.
Okay, thanks.
All right. So here are the adverse drug events that were included in the model. We only included those adverse drug events that either were very severe and different from placebo or that had a frequency of greater than 5%, and they're shown here. Here are the drug costs per dose. The wholesale acquisition cost is the middle column, and then the cost input that we used in the model is the column to the right. For lasmiditan and rimegepant, we do not have a wholesale acquisition cost yet, so we used $78.38, which was a 20% premium pricing above branded Sumatriptan, Imitrex, which was we had from a publication of an expert who was predicting what the costs would likely be or what would be supported by the evidence. We did have WAC for ubrogepant. It was $85, and we used WAC minus 27% in the model, which is $62.05. For usual care, we used a mix of treatments from an epidemiologic study that evaluated what therapies are commonly used, because in our model, patients either were, the comparator was either triptans or patients were not eligible for triptans. We removed triptans from that mix and used the data that we had available to predict what the mix of treatments would look like. Here are the utility data, and this is, once again, these are utility data for severe pain, moderate pain, mild pain, and no pain. You can see that patients suffering severe pain have a significant drop in utility, down to 0.44, whereas no pain, this is an otherwise young population who would have good quality of life relative to many of the conditions that we model here, where it's usually older populations, and so they do have a high utility value. We used an age-adjusted utility value for no pain. We were unable to find anything in the literature around nausea, vomiting, photophobia, and phonophobia, and that's a limitation of our modeling. We did not include that data, so we may be underestimating some of the benefits of these treatments. I just want to make that clear. For adverse drug events, the range varied from a disutility, meaning that if you suffer the adverse event, you have a lower utility for that 48-hour period or for a portion of that 48-hour period. And that disutility is shown here between 0.013 to negative 0.069. For emergency department visits and hospitalizations, we did what is often done in economic models. We don't have good estimates for utility for those, so we used values that are often used in other models, which was a significant disutility associated with emergency department visits and hospitalizations. And here are the results, the base case results. What we see in this slide is that for usual care, we have a 2-year total cost of about $10,000. And you can see that with lasmiditan or imaglipan and ubrogepant, we have about a $3,000 to $4,500 increase in the total cost of care over the 2-year period of time. With sumatriptan and elatriptan, we actually saw a decrease in the total cost of care because of emergency department visits avoided, hospitalizations avoided, and so on. And the cost of these drugs now that they're generic is very minimal. So we actually saw some cost savings with those therapies. For the quality adjusted life years gained, you can see the values are very close for all of the treatments. They go to the 3rd decimal place before we start to see differences. But there are differences. They do start to show difference at that point. And then for hours of pain, we see the usual care is 2,100 hours of pain over a 2-year period of time. And for elatriptan, rather, the lowest one is 1,484. The other therapies are between 1,700 and almost 1,900 hours of pain. It's a lot of pain. For base case incremental results, compared with usual care, we see the cost effectiveness of these treatments varies between $328,000 to $560,000. We see that the incremental cost per hour of pain avoided ranges from $10 to a little over $19 per hour of pain avoided. For one-way sensitivity analyses around the base case values, we subjected the model to all of the inputs to these analyses. There are some important variables. I'm not showing how they affected the values here because none of the values dropped below our threshold or resulted in a drop of our threshold to below 150,000 per quality gained, but they did have significant impact on the model. And you can see in the report, we do report out all of this. Here is the probabilistic sensitivity analysis. The thresholds are shown at 50,000, 100,000, and 150,000 per quality gain. Those are the green vertical lines. And then for each of the treatments are modeled here. What we see is usual care is the preferred option in the majority of our Monte Carlo simulations that we ran. So most of the time, and almost all of them, usual care was the preferred methodology up to a threshold of 150,000. What we see is that ubrogepant and lasmiditan start to become preferred if we move that cost effectiveness threshold to a higher number. All right, here's our scenario analyses. The modified societal perspective included days of work lost or regained, rather, because of successful treatment. We did not include caregiver burden in this analysis. And so that, again, is a limitation of the analysis. For the modified societal perspective, we see that all of the incremental cost effectiveness ratios improved, but did not drop below the 150,000 per quality gained. Increasing the GPANT effectiveness after 2 hours, there is some emerging evidence, which I'm going to present in a little more detail in a second. We do see that if we alter the GPANT effectiveness after 2 hours, we do see a reduction in the cost per quality gained to below the thresholds. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And then 5-year time horizon had minimal to no impact on the cost effectiveness thresholds, which sort of validated our decision to use the 2-year time horizon. These are acute episodes, and we know whether or not treatments work quickly. So there was no need to do a lifetime time horizon. It would have limited to no effect on our estimates. All right, so as I mentioned, there are emerging evidence from a post hoc analysis that was submitted to ICER that strongly suggests there's a delayed onset of action for ubrogepant, and then in a publication, there's evidence that rimegepant may also have a similar effect. Data from analyses of ubrogepant showed a consistent increased effectiveness at 48 hours compared with placebo. So we saw an increased effectiveness compared with the 2-hour time point. However, due to study design, the effect size at 48 hours was still very difficult to estimate. There was a lot of patients who were censored in this data because they had taken a rescue medication. And so we had to try and tease out what some of these effects were. We believe it's a real effect. We don't know what the effect size is. We conducted an additional scenario analysis using our best estimate for the 8-hour time point. And since this was a new analysis conducted after the release of the revised report, we included the newly released WAC price for ubrogepant, WAC minus 27% rebate in the analysis. And so here's what we see, again, these same slides looking at different time points. And you can see that at 8 hours, there's a lot more people who are pain-free when we incorporate this new data. It becomes very obvious. And then here are the costs, QALYs, and hours of pain for these estimates compared with usual care. And then the cost effectiveness is in the graph below. We see a cost effectiveness of $40,000 per QALY gained for using the ubrogepant WAC minus 27% for the price and these additional benefits that we see. And so don't want to go too much over time. So I'll just move on. The limitations are that prices are not known for all of the new treatments. We only know for ubrogepant. We use placeholder prices for all of these new treatments. These may not be the prices that they come out at. And so keep that in mind when you're reviewing the cost effectiveness. The drug price has an important effect on the cost effectiveness. Randomization in clinical trials was maintained until the 2-hour time point. The results beyond 2 hours were potentially biased. As a result, the model primarily used results at 2 hours and in 2-hour responders only, and may not adequately address longer-term effectiveness of these agents, repeat dosing, or long-term use. It does not capture repeat dosing. Rimegepant and ubrogepant may have a delayed onset of action in some patients, and the long-term impact on migraine frequency is not known, so those were not incorporated into the model. Likelihood of discontinuing treatment for lack of effectiveness, and the impact on the effectiveness of treatment in patients continuing to take the medication is also not known. We did receive some comments back. Here are those comments listed. There was a comment that we should be using clinical trial efficacy observations beyond 2 hours in the cost effectiveness analysis, which I pointed out the reasons why we did not. That we should implement treatment discontinuation effects into the CEA as described in the draft evidence report, which we did for the revised report. That we should include adverse event costs in the CEA, which we did not because we incorporated discontinuation in the model for those who suffered severe adverse events. So there would be no cost beyond the first episode, which would be minimal. And then we should include the cost of relevant usual care comparators, which was not included in the draft, and we did include that as I presented in the revised response. So in conclusion, in patients for whom triptans are not effective, not tolerated, or are contraindicated, the first population we evaluated, and if these drugs are priced with the placeholder prices used in this analysis, ubrogepant again had the actual price used, they will exceed commonly accepted thresholds for cost effectiveness. Using the estimated placeholder prices in the base case, the triptans are more effective and less expensive than the newer agents. And due to designs of clinical trials, there's considerable uncertainty around the cost effectiveness estimates generated in the model. And so with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Reem, can we start with you?
Well, thank you for a really well-done presentation. I have a question of clarification. So if I'm reading the key model assumptions, one of them is that if migraine treatment resulted in migraine pain or no pain or mild pain at 2 hours, a person would be able to work.
Yes.
This based on listening to Katie and reading some of the patients' points in the report seem to be an uncertain assumption.
It is.
But for me to be very clear, if I'm trying to translate in my head, if that assumption was not true, the implications is that for the modified societal perspective, if anything, these are overestimation of benefit. So if that assumption is not true, and people cannot go back to work when they're pain-free or mild pain at 2 hours, these numbers are even going to be higher or worse. Is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
Yes.
Aaron.
That was a great presentation, thank you. And I think this is in the evidence report, but I feel like I want to make sure that it's explicit because I think it's going to come into the discussion later. But if I was hearing you correctly, with respect to the triptans compared to usual care, the costs were lower and the benefits were greater, meaning that it dominates. And so I just want to make sure that that's clear, that with respect to the triptans, they actually dominate over usual care. There's not even an incremental cost effectiveness. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so I'm just sort of curious why we should, okay, fine, that's good for later.
Bijan.
Okay, so my question is sort of very general. I think you did mention, and most of the trials, the evidence that we are sort of that are going into this report or this model, they are based on one episode or one sort of acute attack, right? Now,
correct.
And now this model can potentially have these acute episodes like almost every 48 hours for 2 years. So now, in terms of what happens in terms of taking the parameters, are you taking essentially if the person goes on to having say 3, 4, 5 attacks during the 2-year period? So in terms of the evidence, in terms of the effectiveness, are you taking the same parameters over and over again, the one that you sort of?
Yes.
So again, that could be an underestimation, right? Meaning about the effectiveness, because we don't know really. We don't know what happens if the person keeps taking the same drug for multiple episodes.
Right. I actually don't know which direction that might go in. I think that's a good opportunity to bring up this other point that I didn't highlight in this presentation, and that's we incorporated kind of a novel aspect to repeat dosing of the medications. These medicines are for acute migraine, and patients will know whether or not the medicine works for them fairly early on, and if it doesn't, they'll stop taking the medicine. So what that does to the remaining population of patients, it would be anticipated that the drug would get more effective over time in that remaining group of patients because you're removing all those who don't respond to the medicine. We would then expect that those who remain in the population taking the medication would be responders, and it would improve over time. And we built that into the model. And we set it equal to about 0.5 of the potential maximum benefit that they could get. So we have no idea what that estimate actually is, but we wanted to see what impact it might have on the model. And so we did build that in. Whereas with a typical chronic medication, you take the medication on a regular basis. You don't know if it works until years and years later when you have an MI or don't have an MI, that type of, so with this, we do know fairly early on. So we tried to build in some benefit in the model for that. I don't know how that affects our estimates, if we're overestimating or underestimating that effect, because we don't have evidence around what those estimates are. It would be nice to generate that kind of information, and that's what modeling does sometimes. It brings to light where there are gaps in evidence.
Don, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. Really good presentation. I have a couple of quick questions and then a comment.
Okay.
relative to understanding this population, which I think Ms. Golden pointed out is heterogeneous, as we know. First is just to clarify, is the sensitivity analysis around an acute episode only?
No, it's for the entire duration. It's for the 2 years of the
but
model.
In other words, it includes prevention?
No, no,
Okay.
it does not
So-
include
so-
prevention.
All right, so then the second is, and this was helpful to me because patients have other symptoms besides pain, as we know. And it seems like symptom complex is just the way I sort of bluntly think of all things related to migraine. And are there any published data on the utility around the larger ball of, okay, so.
No, unfortunately. I mean, I wish we had that data to work with, and it was something that we couldn't just assume because we have no idea what the estimate would be and what impact it would have. So it's a limitation of the model.
So then thank you. So then my comment is, in thinking about the fact that 86% of these subjects were women, and the fact that we know, I think from an epidemiologic standpoint, that women who are premenopausal, as I'll call it, have a higher incidence of migraines related to menstruation, for example, and in the perimenopausal group, those on average tend to subside, and so normalizing that to age 40 makes me wonder about looking at these subpopulations a bit more critically. And it also makes me wonder, and I know the data probably isn't there, but thinking about lifetime duration of the problem, and also the other big issue here is the non-pharmacologic approaches that are sort of so widespread with trying to solve the personal approach to dealing with the symptom complex. So.
Yeah, and I'll just comment on that a little bit. So the cost effectiveness of these treatments, it really depends on each migraine. And so as we showed with looking at 2 years versus 5 years, it was really just discontinuation that was maybe affecting the cost effectiveness ratio a little bit more. But the long-term cost effectiveness is almost identical to the cost effectiveness if we evaluated just a single migraine episode and the cost effectiveness of treating a single migraine episode. So I do agree different populations, there may be different effectiveness of the treatments, and that was not captured here. But when we're talking about migraine frequency, that probably, unless the treatments have different effectiveness for patients with different migraine frequency, that is not going to be affected. And we definitely would not pick that up in the model because we don't have that evidence.
Nicholas?
Yeah, I just wanted to confirm that these value estimates, as we're trying to think about how robust they are, they depend on the assumption that these drugs won't be used for long-term prevention. So in other words, if these drugs were used for prevention, the value estimates that we have up here would be off.
I guess that depends if the medications reduce the severity of migraine and if there's some interaction in the treatments that are used for reducing migraine frequency and the impact here. So, I mean, targeting two different receptors might have a synergistic effect. We don't have any of that information, so we didn't model that. We focused on the same population that the clinical trials were designed. And some of those patients did have, were on chronic treatment, but a very small proportion.
Sarah, did you want to add something?
Yes.
It's on a different point, but I do have something to say.
Yeah, please, that would be great.
So your first key model assumption is that mortality is not associated with acute treatment for migraine. That seems like a pretty simplistic assumption. There is studies in the evidence base that shows higher rates of both suicide and suicidal ideation in migraine patients, especially ones with severe migraine with aura. So
47% of those who have migraine with aura have suicidal ideations, and 13% of those living with migraine actually die by suicide. Take that in.
So, we have a lot of years of data of people studying migraine, and there are still no studies showing the treatment for migraine affects mortality. And so without evidence showing that any treatment for migraine has ever reduced mortality, we didn't suggest that it be in the model.
I understand the way that you have to model it. I'm here as a patient to tell you that a lot of these assumptions are very far off from the truth of what patients experience every single day. And even if I think the assumption was that this population had 4 migraine attacks a month, and there are 40 million, about 40 million Americans who have migraine. Everybody is different. I could have somebody else could have 4 in one month, and 15 in another month, and 8 in the next month. And it just feels, one point that was made was that baseline care versus one of the GPANs, it was actually 600 hours of more utility. I believe, sorry, I need to find this in my notes real quick so I say this properly. On slide 66, scenario analysis results. Japan, looking at the hours of pain, almost 1,600 hours of pain. And then usual care, I'm assuming, and maybe you said this, is that over the counter? Is that triptans? Is that
it included,
a multitude?
Yeah, it included everything that is prevalent, that's commonly used for migraine from epidemiologic studies.
Right.
So it included everything, including triptans, but we removed the triptans because it didn't make sense to leave them in for this.
Gotcha. Well, so just want to point out the hours between, of the hours of pain between the two. While it might not seem significant to you, roughly 500, 600 hours of less pain, to me, that's 25 days. That's 25 days a year. I would give anything to have 25 days of no pain.
It's one of the, I was struck by the, Katie, I was struck by the data on slide 66 as well, and in terms of the magnitude of the difference in terms of hours of pain. And it's interesting because I think that the kind of the conclusion of the incremental cost per quality in this particular slide supports the very conclusion that you're making, right? Which is this is a meaningful magnitude of difference between the usual care group and the treatment, if I understood that correctly.
Yes. And the reason we left this as a scenario analysis is because we don't have really good unbiased information on what happens at 8 hours. And we do have some additional slides. I'm not sure when we want to show them. We're going to show them after lunch. We have the slides that were submitted to us by this company and the estimates.
That's great.
Yeah.
My only comment, maybe to close up this section, has to do with this interesting phenomena here, which is that if the product doesn't work, people stop taking it. So you have a group of people that have durability, that the benefit is durable for them, and so they continue to take it. But what happens, and I think in the modeling, if I understood this correctly, is that on my no pain days, I just return to a base state of no pain from a quality of life metric or utility. But I might think that this particular group who is enjoying the benefit of this, and given the anxiety, depression, and other chronic attributes of migraine sufferers, that the quality of life estimate during the no pain state prior to treatment is actually lower, right? And that you might get some lift among this particular population in the no pain state, which would then, and that's kind of my gut, right? When I think about the stories and I think about migraine as a chronic condition, while it
Episodic.
It would episodic
attacks.
Episodic attacks
or
with a chronic
daily
condition.
attacks.
So that for some folks, we may be underestimating the quality of life lift from the no pain state for people where there is benefit, right? It would not be true. I take the medicine 3 times, it doesn't work for me. Like that scenario would not be true. And maybe you thought about this in the modeling, but it's just kind of my my reaction to the data and the stories that I hear about. I don't know if you have a comment on that, or if I can just sign us off to the next section.
Yeah, it would have two effects. One is the benefit of having no migraine would be less.
Right.
But because we're comparing, that will likely get washed out.
Right.
The overall effect would likely be that if anxiety and other things improve, those patients over time who have anxiety would end up having a slightly better quality of life
Right,
than we're estimating the
their
model.
base case quality. Yeah.
Correct. Correct.
And given the 48-hour episode, like you move into a pain state, it's a relatively small amount of the total quality of life calculation for the year.
I think a bigger limitation of the model than that is that we couldn't model anything other than head pain.
Yeah,
that's,
for sure. Yeah.
I think that would have a much bigger impact on the model.
I think you're right. I think that's a great point. Christopher, and then we'll close up. Yeah.
I just want to say thanks also for what I think is an absolutely heroic effort to try to model a complex phenomenon and to take so many things into consideration. I'm particularly interested in this, again, discussion about thinking about people who discontinue or don't respond and the relative enrichment of that population. But it relates to the question about consistency. So there are studies, there is data about the triptans indicating that if you compared, it's not simply single attacks, but multiple attacks. And I think for me, at least, the take-home lesson there is when you model 3 or 4 attacks, that the net effect is much higher. That even if the therapeutic gain was 20 or 30% for a single attack, that treating successfully 2 or 3 out of attacks or 3 out of 3 is 50%. So I imagine that you could include that kind of information in your model and, or at least perform some kind of sensitivity analysis about how that would affect your estimates.
Yes, we absolutely could. The way the model's designed, we can build that into the model. I mean, we could run the model with those. The problem is we don't have estimates to put in. So
the new
anything we put in
for the new
would be-
treatments.
Yeah, would be a guess. It would be great. Again, one of the key benefits of modeling is identifying where there are limitations in the literature. And I think we've done that here. There's a lot of uncertainty in our model. There are things that we believe may happen that logically should happen that we just don't have estimates for. And I would encourage any researchers out there and any patient advocate groups
If you're
and
listening on the
funders.
internet, this is your call for a research project.
Yeah.
But